The morning light spilled through the glass walls of the Lockhart Tower, painting the office in shades of gold and blue. Chicago stretched far below, tiny cars, silent rivers of people, and the hum of a city that pulsed to Graham Lockhart's command. Inside, the world was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the soft echo of his footsteps across polished marble. Graham stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, hands clasped behind his back, eyes sharp and calculating. To most, he was more machine than man, a creature carved from discipline, driven by numbers, feared for his precision. One misplaced decimal, one delayed call, could cost millions, and Graham never made mistakes. That morning, his life revolved around one call, a deal that could save his empire or destroy it. Investors in Zurich were waiting, lawyers were circling, and every second felt like a heartbeat counting down to his fate. He straightened his tie, glanced at the clock again, and sighed. The silence of the room comforted him. It was the silence of control. Then the intercom buzzed, his assistant's voice trembling through. "Sir, the delegation is ready downstairs." Graham nodded to himself, grabbed his briefcase, and turned for the door. At that same moment, Rosa Alvarez entered quietly, pushing her cleaning cart, her uniform faded from years of use. She had learned how to move like a shadow in this world of suits and glass. Every surface gleamed under her hands, but she never looked up at the man whose name hung on every door. Today, however, she wasn't alone. Her daughter, Mia, a small girl with wide brown eyes and 2 loose braids, trailed behind her holding a worn teddy bear by one arm. Rosa whispered to her in Spanish to stay still, stay quiet, stay invisible. The school had flooded, and she had nowhere else to take her. Graham, distracted, waved a hand without looking back. "Fine, just silence." As the elevator doors closed behind him, the massive office grew still again. The city hummed faintly below, the clock ticked, and the phone on the mahogany desk sat waiting. Mia stood at the edge of the carpet, her small face tilted toward the view outside. The buildings looked like toy blocks. The clouds were so close, she thought she could touch them. She wandered closer to the desk, fingers brushing the cool surface. Her mother's voice echoed faintly from the hallway, the sound of a vacuum starting up. Then came the ring, a sharp, sudden sound that made her jump. The name on the glowing screen flashed unfamiliar letters. Victor Marine. The phone kept ringing, insistent, almost alive. Mia hesitated. The way the machine buzzed filled the empty room like a cry for attention. Maybe it was her teacher, she thought. Maybe it was someone lost. She reached up with both hands, lifted the heavy phone, and pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" she said softly. There was silence. Then a man's voice, smooth but cold, like ice slipping down glass. "Tell him I know what he's doing," the voice said. "And if he signs those papers, he's finished. Tell him it'll be just like Sam. Tell him I always keep my promises." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Mia frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "You shouldn't say bad things," she whispered, her small voice trembling but firm. "He's my mom's boss." The man chuckled, low and cruel. "Little ears shouldn't listen to grown-up games. Hang up, girl." And then the door opened. Graham Lockhart froze in the doorway. The sound of that voice, the name, the threat, hit him like a physical blow. He saw the phone in Mia's tiny hands, the screen still lit with the name Victor Marin. For a moment he couldn't move. The air seemed to thin around him. Mia turned, startled, the receiver still pressed to her ear. "He said you shouldn't sign something," she murmured, confused. "He said it's like Mr. Sam." Graham's face drained of color. No one outside his boardroom should have known that name. Sam, a man whose downfall had haunted the markets months ago. He crossed the room slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did you say?" Mia blinked, innocent and unafraid. "He said you'd be sorry if you do what Sam did." The phone slipped from Graham's fingers and hit the desk with a hollow thud. For the first time in years, the master of the city stood utterly still, not because of a rival or a lost fortune, but because of a child's words that pierced through his walls of certainty. Somewhere deep inside him, a chill began to grow. Whatever game he had thought he was playing, he now realized he might already have lost. Graham Lockhart stood frozen, the silence in his office so deep it seemed to hum. The phone on his desk blinked with the faint light of the last call, the name Victor Moran glowing like an accusation. The child's voice still echoed in his mind. He said it'll be just like Sam. The words were simple, innocent, but they landed with the weight of dynamite. He couldn't shake the chill that crept through him, the sense that something far darker had slipped through his fortress of glass and steel. Mia's small fingers twisted around the edge of her mother's uniform. Rosa rushed in, her face pale, her hands trembling as she saw Graham staring at her daughter. "Mr. Lockhart, I'm so sorry. She didn't mean... Please, sir, she didn't know it was important." Graham's voice was low, uneven, nothing like the confident tone that ruled boardrooms. "Who told her to pick up that call?" "No one, sir. I was just in the next room. She's a curious child." But Graham barely heard her. He was watching Mia. The little girl wasn't crying or afraid. Her brown eyes were steady, thoughtful, too calm for her age. "What did you hear?" he asked quietly. She looked at the phone as if it might start speaking again. "A man," she said softly. His voice was cold, like he was smiling but angry. "He said you shouldn't sign something." And he said, "It was just like Sam." The room seemed to tilt. Graham sank into his chair, his pulse hammering in his ears. Sam. He hadn't heard that name in months. Not since the media had buried it beneath headlines about corporate mismanagement and market. Correction. Sam had been a small business owner, a man with rough hands and kind eyes, who had lost everything after investing in a fraudulent venture tied indirectly to Graham's firm. It was all legal, of course. His lawyers had made sure of that. But now, hearing the name again from a child's mouth, something inside him cracked. Rosa pulled Mia behind her, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Please, sir, I'll take her home." "She's just a child. She didn't mean—" "Wait," Graham interrupted, his voice trembling but firm. "You said she's heard that voice before." Mia nodded slowly. "Yes. That night the man outside was talking to someone in a car. I was with Mama and I dropped my teddy. He said the same words, just like Sam." He laughed after. "I remember his voice. I never forget scary voices." Rosa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mia, you shouldn't—" But Graham's blood ran cold. This wasn't coincidence. He rose from his chair, the edges of panic sharpening his voice. "You heard that same voice near your building?" "Yes," Mia said, shrinking a little but not breaking eye contact. "He was talking about making someone disappear." For the first time in his career, Graham felt something unfamiliar, fear that had nothing to do with money. He turned toward the vast window, the city below gleaming with indifferent light. His reflection looked back at him, a powerful man suddenly aware that his fortress might already be burning from within. He snatched up the phone and dialed his head of security. "Darren, I need you in my office. Now. Bring the file on Victor Marin." Within minutes, the door opened and Darren Cole stepped in, tall, watchful, with the heavy calm of someone who had seen too much. "Sir?" Graham didn't waste time. "Pull every record on Marin. Wire transfers, offshore holdings, contracts, everything. I want to know who he works for and what he wants." Darren glanced at the cleaning woman and her daughter, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Sir, what's going on?" Graham's gaze stayed locked on the city skyline. "A child just told me something that none of my executives had the courage or sense to notice." He turned, his eyes colder now. "And I think we've been set up." The air in the room thickened. Darren moved to the wall-size screen and began pulling files, projections, and transaction records. The light from the monitor painted their faces in pale blue. Names and numbers flowed across the display. Shell companies, hidden accounts, layers of deception. Rosa watched silently, clutching Mia close. She didn't understand the details, but she could feel the danger in the billionaire's silence. Darren stopped scrolling. Sir, this isn't normal. The holding company's linked to Marin. They loop back to inactive corporations in Luxembourg and Zurich. But here's the strange part. He tapped the screen. These aren't just financial dead ends. They're traps. They reroute funds in a way that would make you look like the one laundering money. Graham's throat tightened. The call, the warning, Sam, it was all falling into place. Mia tugged lightly at her mother's sleeve. Mama, she whispered, pointing at the screen. It looks like a maze. You think you can get out, but it goes back to the start. Darren froze. He stared at the screen again, tracing the lines. She's right, he said quietly. Every route leads back to your account, sir. The sound of the city seemed distant now, muffled by the weight of realization. Graham ran a trembling hand through his hair. For years he had believed himself untouchable, guarded by lawyers, advisors, walls of glass. But now, it was a child's voice that had pulled the thread and exposed the rot beneath his empire. He looked at Rosa and Mia, standing small and out of place in this cathedral of power. The irony wasn't lost on him. The people he had never seen, the ones who cleaned his floors and polished his trophies, were now the only ones standing between him and ruin. The phone rang again. Victor Marin. The name flashed like a curse. The sound cut through the air, sharp, demanding. Graham's eyes locked on the phone. His instincts screamed to answer, to salvage what was left, to control the narrative. But a different voice, quieter and truer, whispered inside him, "Don't." He let it ring. And as the echo of that unanswered call faded into silence, Graham Lockhart realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. Someone else was pulling the strings, and the only person who could help him untangle them was the little girl who had dared to answer his phone. The city outside glimmered in the fading light, the skyline turning molten gold as dusk settled over Chicago. Inside the penthouse office, the glow of the giant screen cast long, ghostly shadows on the walls. Graham Lockhart sat motionless at his desk, his once perfect composure fractured. The hum of machines filled the silence, a steady reminder that his world was now built on lies. Darren Cole stood beside the screen, his brow furrowed as files continued to flicker open one after another. Rosa Alvarez sat at the far end of the room, clutching her daughter close, as though afraid the glass around them might shatter at any second. It was supposed to be just another day of cleaning. Instead, they were trapped in a secret that could destroy them all. "Sir," Darren said finally, his tone cautious. "I've seen setups before, but this—" He zoomed into one particular transaction highlighted in red. "These transfers don't belong to you. Someone replicated your digital signature. They've been running transactions through your holding accounts for months." Graham's hands tightened on the edge of the desk. "Months?" His voice came out rough. "You're telling me someone's been bleeding my accounts and no one noticed?" Darren hesitated. "Not exactly bleeding, sir. Framing. Whoever's behind this doesn't want your money. They want your name on the crime." The billionaire pushed back from the desk, pacing to the window. The glass reflected his face, drawn, furious, haunted. For years, he had ruled this world like a god. He had believed in systems, control, precision. And now he was just a name waiting to be dragged through the mud. Behind him, Rosa's soft voice broke the silence. "Sir, I don't understand all this, but if it's dangerous, we should go. Please, for my daughter." Graham turned, his tone gentler than before. "No one's going anywhere yet." His gaze shifted to Mia, who was sitting quietly on the carpet, tracing her finger through a puddle of light on the floor. "You said you heard that man's voice before, right?" "Where?" Mia nodded slowly. "In the alley near our home. He was talking to someone in a car. He said your name. I didn't understand the rest, but he was laughing. Like he already won." Darren stepped forward. "We can confirm that. If she remembers where, I can pull the CCTV from nearby traffic cams." Graham stared at Mia, marveling at how calm she was, how unshaken by all this chaos. "You remember the car?" She tilted her head, thinking. Black. Big. It had a sticker on the back window. A gold bird. Darren's eyes snapped to the screen. He typed quickly, pulling up a database. Gold bird. That's the emblem of the Orion Syndicate. Rosa gasped. What is that? Graham answered quietly, almost to himself. Not a company, a broker. They move through shell firms like ghosts, laundering money, collapsing businesses, buying debts from people they ruin. He looked up at Darren. I thought it was a myth. Darren shook his head. Not a myth. I've heard whispers. Nobody knows who runs it. They're like puppeteers. You never see their hands, only the destruction they leave behind. The weight of it pressed down on the room. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over Lake Michigan, and the first streaks of lightning lit up the horizon. The city looked beautiful from up here, but to Graham, it suddenly felt fragile. Every tower could crumble with a single lie. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand trembling just enough for Rosa to notice. Everything I've built, every deal, every merger, it was all supposed to mean something. But if Orion is involved, I'm just another pawn. Darren leaned against the desk. What's your next move? Graham didn't answer right away. He looked at Mia again. The child had gone back to her drawing, small circles, sharp lines, intersecting shapes. She held up the paper suddenly, showing him what looked like a messy spider web. That's what the man said, she murmured. He said no one escapes the web. Graham's heart stuttered. The web. That was what the offshore pattern looked like, lines looping back to him, each one disguised as something harmless. Then his office door burst open. His assistant, pale and shaking, stood there. Sir, you need to see this. She held up a tablet, news headlines flashing across it. Lockhart Holdings under federal investigation. Alleged ties to offshore laundering. Rosa gasped, covering her mouth. Darren muttered a curse under his breath. Graham snatched the tablet, scrolling rapidly. They moved fast. This is planted. It's all planted. His voice rose, echoing off the glass walls. They leaked it before I could react. Sir, Darren said carefully, we need to get you out of the building. If this is coordinated, there will be agents here within the hour. But Graham didn't move. He looked around the office, the empire he had built through discipline and ruthlessness. The marble floor, the cold art, the perfect symmetry. It all looked hollow now. Out of my own building, he whispered. Like a criminal. Mia walked up to him, her small voice cutting through the chaos. They want to scare you. That's what bullies do. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, to Rosa's astonishment, the billionaire actually knelt, his polished shoes clicking against the marble as he crouched to meet the child's eyes. You're right, he said softly. And I've been one of those bullies my whole life. Maybe it's time I learned what it feels like to fight one. The sound of helicopters thudded faintly outside. Sirens wailed in the distance. Darren's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then looked up sharply. They're coming! Graham straightened, his old steel returning, but this time it wasn't the cold armor of arrogance. It was the resolve of a man with something to protect. Then we move, he said. He turned to Rosa and Mia. You stay with me. I don't care what happens to my company anymore. But that man, the one who called, he's not getting near your daughter again. And as lightning flashed across the windows, casting their faces in stark white light, Rosa realized something she never thought possible. The most powerful man in Chicago was no longer fighting to save his empire. He was fighting to save them. The storm outside roared to life, but inside the skyscraper, the true storm had only just begun. Rain lashed against the glass walls of the Lockhart Tower, turning the skyline into a blur of trembling lights. The city that once bowed before Graham Lockhart now seemed to whisper against him, its reflections warping in the darkened windows like ghosts of his past triumphs. In the distance, the wail of sirens drew closer, echoing off the steel canyons below. The empire he'd built with unshakable certainty was collapsing around him, and the only sound inside his penthouse was the slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock that felt like a countdown. Darren Cole stood by the door, his earpiece glowing faintly as he monitored the building's security feeds. They're here, he said quietly. Federal agents, 6 cars, main entrance, loading bay, and 1 team heading for the executive elevator. Rosa gasped, clutching Mia tightly. My God, they'll think we did something. Graham turned toward her, his eyes dark and calm in a way that felt unnatural. They're not here to arrest you, he said. They're here for me. But they won't find what they're looking for. Sir, Darren warned, if they find us here when they breach, it won't matter who's guilty. They'll seize everything. Your files, your accounts, and anyone in this room. Graham's gaze flicked toward the phone on his desk, the same one that had started it all. Its screen was dark now, but he could almost hear the ghost of Marin's voice, oily and smug. Just like Sam. His hands clenched. He had ignored too many warnings in his life. He had dismissed too many voices that didn't come with a title or a degree. But not this time. Pack what you can, Graham ordered Darren. Everything digital, everything that can trace back to Marin or Orion. Darren nodded, moving swiftly to disconnect the drives and sweep the network. The room filled with the clicking of hard drives, the shuffle of papers, the faint whimper of a frightened child. Mia, though pale, stood quietly beside her mother. She held her small teddy bear, its fur damp from her nervous hands, and stared out the window at the lights below. It looks like the city is crying, she whispered. Graham paused. For a fleeting moment, he saw the world through her eyes, fragile, scared, human. He had spent decades above the city, looking down at people as numbers on a screen. Now, the people he'd never noticed were the only ones standing beside him. Suddenly, the intercom crackled. A voice boomed through the speakers. Federal Task Force. Step away from all devices and open the door. Rosa froze. What do we do? Darren glanced at Graham. Service corridor, he said. It runs behind the executive suite, leads to maintenance. I can get you to the lower floors before they breach. Graham nodded once. Move. They slipped into the hidden corridor, just as the heavy steel door to his office burst open. The sound of boots and shouts echoed down the hallway behind them. Rosa clutched Mia's hand as they ran, the billionaire's polished shoes slipping on the narrow concrete steps. The hallway was cramped, industrial, nothing like the sterile perfection of his world above. It smelled of oil and rust, humming with the noise of unseen machinery. Halfway down the stairwell, they stopped to catch their breath. Darren's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the message before his jaw tightened. Marin just issued a statement. He's saying you were laundering money through his company. He's handing over documents to the feds. Graham's chest tightened. Documents we didn't sign. Doesn't matter, Darren said grimly. He forged everything. And without your access codes, no one can prove otherwise. A low thunder rumbled outside, vibrating through the concrete. Rosa's voice broke softly. What will happen to you? Graham turned to her, the weight of his empire gone from his shoulders. What happens to me doesn't matter anymore. But what Marin did, what Orion did, goes beyond business. They've done this before. They ruin people, use them as shields, and then vanish into the dark. Mia looked up at him, her small voice barely a whisper. Like Mr. Sam? He met her gaze. Yes, he said quietly. Like Mr. Sam. And if I don't stop them, there'll be more. Darren finished securing the portable drive in his bag. We have a few minutes. There's a maintenance lift that leads to the loading dock. If we're lucky, we can blend into the evacuation team. But luck was something Graham no longer believed in. The building shuddered faintly as thunder boomed overhead, and a faint alarm began to wail through the floors, an automated lockdown triggered by the breach upstairs. Red emergency lights flickered along the narrow corridor, painting their faces in pulses of crimson. Mia pressed against Rosa's side, frightened but silent. Graham crouched beside her. You were brave, he said softly. If you hadn't answered that call, I'd be in handcuffs right now. Maybe worse. She blinked, then reached out and placed her tiny hand against his sleeve. You were angry when I did it, she said matter-of-factly. He managed a faint, broken smile. I was wrong. The faint clatter of footsteps echoed from below. Darren's voice dropped to a whisper. We're not alone. They ducked behind a row of metal crates as flashlights danced across the lower landing. Voices carried upward. Low, deliberate, wrong. Marin says they're in the service shaft. Secure the exits. Rosa clutched her daughter tighter. Graham exchanged a look with Darren. He's sending men, not agents. Yeah, Darren muttered. And they're not here to make arrests. The sound of boots drew closer. Graham's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He looked around desperately, the ventilation shaft above them, the sealed access door to the boiler room. His mind raced through the floor plans he had once designed himself. There was a narrow crawl space that ran beneath the East Tower wall, the dangerous forgotten route used only during construction. This way, he whispered. They moved quickly, slipping through a narrow hatch and into the darkness beyond. The passage smelled of dust and old concrete. The hum of the storm faded into a distant drone, replaced by the echo of their breathing and the soft creak of metal. Mia held onto her teddy bear tightly. Rosa whispered prayers under her breath. Graham, who had once walked among the world's elite, crawled through the guts of his own building, now hunted, humiliated, but more alive than he'd been in years. Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel. A small maintenance door opened into a half-renovated office floor, empty except for scattered tools and a single flickering light. Darren checked his weapon, scanning the corners. We're clear. For now, Graham stood, brushing dust from his clothes, staring at the city lights beyond the plastic-covered windows. They shimmered like distant stars, unreachable and indifferent. It's gone, he said quietly. Everything I built. Everything I thought made me powerful. Rosa placed a trembling hand on his arm. You still have a chance, sir. You still have truth. He looked at her, the words sinking deeper than he expected. Truth. It had never mattered to him before. But now, in the dark, truth was all that separated him from the men hunting him. In the corner, Mia was drawing again. Lines, arrows, loops. Darren crouched beside her, curious. What are you making, kiddo? She pointed at the tangled shapes on the paper. A web, she said softly. Because he said no one escapes it. But that's not true. She looked up at Graham. We just have to cut it. Lightning flashed outside, and for the first time that night, Graham Lockhart smiled. Not the arrogant smile of a man in control, but the quiet, resolute one of a man ready to fight back. Somewhere above them, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the tower, followed by the distant roar of thunder. The world was collapsing, but in that hidden, half-lit floor, something new was being born. The hunted billionaire had finally stopped running. The night bled into dawn, but there was no sunrise. Only a gray, trembling light that crept through the torn plastic sheets covering the windows of the abandoned floor. The storm had passed, leaving the city drenched and breathless. Inside, the silence was broken only by the distant hum of generators and the soft tapping of rain leaking through cracks in the ceiling. Graham Lockhart sat on the cold concrete floor, his back against the wall, his once impeccable suit stained with dust and sweat. The billionaire who once dictated the rhythm of Chicago's financial world now looked like a man half forgotten by it. Rosa Alvarez sat nearby, holding a thermos of coffee she'd managed to find in a break room downstairs. She offered it to him quietly. You should drink, she said softly. He hesitated before taking it. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of having lost control for the first time in his life. Do you know, he murmured, staring into the steaming cup. I used to think control was power. Every meeting, every deal, every word rehearsed and perfect. Now I realize control was just the illusion I sold myself. Rose's expression was weary but kind. When you have nothing left to control, you finally see what matters. Across the room, Mia sat cross-legged with her teddy bear, sketching quietly on a sheet of paper. The air smelled faintly of old paint and metal. Darren Cole was hunched over a laptop, tapping into encrypted databases. His face was tense, jaw clenched, eyes darting from one screen to another. "We have a problem," Darren said finally, his voice cutting through the stillness. Marin's statement was just the beginning. Orion's team leaked internal emails, fabricated ones. They make it look like you orchestrated the whole fraud. Offshore accounts, coded transfers, falsified partnerships. Every piece looks real. They've buried us under evidence that doesn't exist. Graham rose slowly, pacing the floor. "And the feds believe it?" Darren nodded grimly. "They don't just believe it. They're building a case. You'll be arrested by tonight if we don't act." "Then we fight," Graham said, his voice low, determined. "Not with money, not with lawyers. With truth." Rosa looked up, confused. "How can you fight people who live in shadows?" "By shining light where they can't hide," Graham replied. "We find proof that Orion exists. We expose him." Darren leaned back in his chair. "Sir, men like him don't leave footprints. He builds ghosts, companies that don't exist, people who disappear after signing papers. The only ones who ever saw him." He hesitated, didn't live to talk about it. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. Rosa instinctively reached for Mia, pulling her close. But Mia's small voice broke through, calm and clear. "He'll come back," she said. Everyone turned to her. The man from the phone. "He'll come back. He said he always keeps his promises." Graham froze. Those were Marin's words, spoken through the phone that fateful morning. He always keeps his promises. But what did he mean? Darren's phone buzzed. A notification popped up. A live feed from the building's security network, still partially active. He frowned. "Sir, you need to see this." On the cracked laptop screen, a camera showed the lobby below. A convoy of black cars had just pulled up outside the tower. Men in suits spilled out. Not government agents, but private security. At the center of the frame was Victor Marin. His grin was unmistakable, cruel and confident. "He's here," Darren whispered. Rosa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Why would he come here? Isn't he afraid? Graham's eyes narrowed. "He's not afraid because he thinks I'm trapped. He's coming to bury me personally." Marin stepped through the lobby, flanked by two men with earpieces. He spoke into his phone as cameras caught the movement of his lips. Darren zoomed in on the footage, reading them aloud. He's saying, "Clean the floors upstairs." "No traces," Rosa's voice trembled. "Clean the floors?" She looked around, horrified. He means us. Before anyone could react, the elevator lights flickered. The mechanical whir of machinery echoed through the empty floor. The elevator was moving up. "They're coming," Darren said. Graham grabbed Rosa's arm. "Get Mia. Now!" The service stairwell door rattled in the wind, the faint sound of footsteps climbing closer. Darren shut the laptop, shoving it into his backpack. "We need to move!" They sprinted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the silence. The hallway stretched endlessly, lined with half-finished drywall and hanging cables. Behind them, the elevator doors opened with a heavy ding. "Search everything!" Marin's voice thundered through the halls. "They're here!" Darren motioned toward a side room. "This way!" They ducked inside, a small, windowless maintenance office. The air was thick with dust. Graham pressed his ear against the metal door, listening to the footsteps getting closer. Rosa's breathing quickened. Mia clutched her teddy bear, her little face pale but composed. Then, faintly, through the ventilation shaft, came Marin's voice again. "I told you, Lockhart, no one walks away from Orion. You were useful. Now you're finished." Graham's blood ran cold. He turned to Darren. "He's working for Orion, not with him." Darren nodded. "Which means Orion is close. Close enough to want to watch this himself." The footsteps outside stopped. Silence. Then came a single, deliberate knock on the door. Graham gestured for everyone to stay quiet. The second knock was harder. Then Marin's muffled voice. Open up, Graham. We can still make a deal. Rosa squeezed Mia's hand, whispering a prayer. Graham took a breath, his mind racing. He looked around the room, spotting a vent cover loose on the wall. Darren, he whispered, get them out through there. Now. What about you? Darren hissed. I'll hold them long enough for you to get her out. Rosa's eyes widened. No, you'll be killed. But Graham only smiled faintly. I've been dead inside for years. Let me do something that matters before the end. The door handle rattled violently. Darren pried the vent open, pushing Rosa and Mia through one by one. The metal scraped, the noise almost too loud. Marin's voice grew impatient. Break it down! Graham turned as the door burst open. Marin stepped inside, his smile thin and sharp. There you are, he said, adjusting his cuffs. The great Graham Lockhart, reduced to hiding in a broom closet. You set me up, Graham said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. But you made one mistake, Marin chuckled. And what's that? You underestimated a 5-year-old. Marin frowned. What? Before he could finish, Graham lunged, grabbing a wrench from the workbench and slamming it into the fire alarm panel. The sirens exploded to life, shrieking through the entire floor. Sprinklers burst overhead, spraying water everywhere. Chaos. Darren reappeared behind Marin, tackling one of the guards. Another drew his weapon, firing wildly into the ceiling. Sparks rained down. Graham shoved Marin backward into a metal shelf, pinning him down as water soaked them both. You think I'm afraid of you? Graham shouted. You work for a ghost. But ghosts die too when someone drags them into the light. Marin struggled, his laughter manic even as he coughed through the spray. You can't stop him. You don't even know his name. But Mia did. As Rosa and the girl crawled through the vent, the child clutched her teddy bear tighter, whispering to herself, Orion, that's what he called him. The man who watches. And in that moment, as thunder cracked once more above the tower, Graham Lockhart realized that this wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of war. The city woke to chaos. News anchors spoke in clipped, urgent tones, their words rolling across every screen in Chicago. Lockhart empire crumbles amidst scandal. Fugitive billionaire on the run. Federal probe expands, offshore crimes linked to Lockhart Holdings. Every headline carried his name like poison. Every photograph of him, the once untouchable king of finance, now painted him as the villain. But what the world didn't see was that Graham Lockhart wasn't hiding from justice. He was hunting it. The warehouse smelled of oil and decay. It sat on the river's edge, abandoned for decades, its iron beams rusting like the bones of an old machine. Inside, the dim light from a flickering bulb cast long shadows on the wet floor. Graham stood near the open loading dock, the cold wind whipping through his soaked shirt. His suit was ruined, his face marked by exhaustion and bruises. Yet behind his eyes burned something fierce, purpose. Darren Cole crouched nearby, setting up surveillance equipment scavenged from a police contact who still owed him a favor. Rosa Alvarez stood behind them, clutching Mia close, her face pale but resolute. The child had not spoken since the chaos of the night before, yet her eyes were watchful, as though she were seeing far more than the adults around her. Darren broke the silence. Marin's dead, Graham looked up sharply. What? They found his body in the river an hour ago, Darren said. Single shot to the chest. Execution style, Rosa gasped, covering her mouth. Oh, dear God. Graham exhaled slowly, staring at the rippling water outside. That's Orion, he said quietly. He's cleaning house. Marin was a pawn, and pawns get sacrificed when the game changes. Darren nodded grimly. And now he's the only player left. The faint buzz of an old radio cracked in the corner. A distorted voice came through, the signal breaking with static. Lockhart. Still at large. Authorities. Warning public. Armed and dangerous. Graham turned away from it. He'd stopped listening to the world's version of his story. He wants me framed as the monster, he said. And he's almost succeeded. But if he thinks he can erase every trace of what he did, he's wrong. Mia tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mommy, she whispered. He's coming, isn't he? Rosa blinked, startled. What do you mean, sweetheart? The child's gaze was fixed on the shadows near the far door. The man with the shiny shoes. He's watching us. Everyone froze. Darren drew his gun silently, motioning for Rosa to stay still. The sound of dripping water echoed in the vast emptiness. Then, from beyond the door came a slow, deliberate clap. Well done, Mr. Lockhart, a voice said. Smooth, melodic, confident. It was the voice from the phone, the one that had haunted Graham's nights ever since. The door creaked open, and he stepped into view, Orion. He was tall, immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit that looked out of place amid the grime. His face was calm, his expression almost kind, but his eyes, sharp, gray, unblinking, were colder than steel. He smiled faintly as he stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. So this is what it looks like when gods fall, Orion said softly. I must admit, I didn't expect you to survive this long. Most of my creations collapse quietly. Graham's voice was low and raw. You destroyed lives. Sam, Marin, me, how many others? Orion tilted his head as though considering the question. Destroyed? No, I corrected the balance. You people build empires from greed, from arrogance. I merely take them apart when you forget what they cost. Don't pretend this is justice, Graham spat. You're a thief in a suit, perhaps, Orion said, smiling. But a principled one. Behind him, 2 armed men entered, silent, precise, their faces hidden. Darren raised his gun, but Orion lifted a hand. No need for violence, he said smoothly. You have something I want, Mr. Lockhart. The data from Marin's servers. The child saw it, didn't she? The web, as she called it. Graham's chest tightened. You're not getting near her. Orion's eyes flicked toward Mia, who stood half-hidden behind Rosa's legs. Ah, the little prophet. It's strange how children see what adults cannot. She must have an extraordinary memory. He took a slow step closer. Rosa instinctively shielded her daughter. Stay back, she hissed. Orion chuckled softly. The cleaner's courage. Touching. You have no idea how rare loyalty like that is among your kind. Graham moved then, stepping between them. You'll have to kill me first. Orion smiled wider. Oh, Graham. That's the idea. In one swift motion, Darren fired. The shot echoed, shattering the bulb above. The room plunged into darkness, chaos erupting. Muzzle flashes lit the air like lightning. Rosa screamed, pulling Mia behind a stack of crates. Graham tackled Orion to the ground, fists striking the polished mask of calm that finally cracked into fury. They rolled across the floor, grappling for control. Orion's elbow slammed into Graham's ribs. Pain flared white-hot. You think this ends with you? Orion hissed. There are 10 of me. 100. You'll never cut every thread. Graham managed to grab a metal rod, swinging it hard. It caught Orion's shoulder with a crack. Then I'll start with 1, he growled. Darren disarmed one of Orion's men, knocking him unconscious. The other fled toward the docks, his footsteps fading into the night. Sirens wailed in the distance, closer this time. Orion staggered to his feet, blood trailing down his temple. You're too late, Lockhart, he said through a twisted smile. The world already believes the lie. Even if I die here, you'll die with me, in their eyes. Graham stepped forward, breath ragged, eyes blazing. Maybe, but at least I'll die knowing I finally saw the truth. Before Orion could respond, Darren raised his weapon again. Drop it, he barked. Hands up! But Orion only laughed, a sound cold and hollow. I told you, he said. You can't stop me. Then he pressed a button on the device hidden in his sleeve. An explosion ripped through the far wall. The shockwave knocked them all to the ground. Fire burst through the crates, filling the air with smoke and heat. Rosa screamed for Mia. Darren dragged her toward the exit, coughing. Graham crawled through the haze, searching for the man, but Orion was gone, vanished into the smoke like a phantom. Outside, the warehouse burned, orange flames reflecting in the river. Fire trucks wailed. Police lights painted the scene in chaos. Graham stumbled out with Mia in his arms, Rosa sobbing behind him. Darren followed, limping, clutching his shoulder. They watched as the roof collapsed, the inferno swallowing everything. Graham's chest heaved as he looked at the destruction. "He's not dead," he said hoarsely. Darren nodded grimly. "No, but he's running out of places to hide." Mia rested her head on Graham's shoulder, whispering softly, "You hurt bad?" He looked down at her, his bruised face breaking into the faintest smile. "Not as bad as before." The girl's eyes flickered toward the flames. "He'll come back." Graham followed her gaze. The fire danced like something alive, hungry, moving, unstoppable. "Then we'll be ready," he said quietly. "Because this time we're not running." The wind carried the scent of smoke and metal. Somewhere in the distance, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, touching the river's surface with gold. For the first time, Graham Lockhart wasn't looking down on his city from above. He was standing in the ashes, with the people who mattered, and preparing to fight for something real. The war with Orion had just begun. The wind that morning cut through Chicago like glass, sharp and relentless. Smoke from the warehouse still hung in the air, drifting low across the river like a ghost that refused to die. From the smoldering wreckage, investigators pulled what they thought were the final fragments of the Lockhart scandal: burned documents, melted metal, a single charred laptop. To the world it looked like an ending. But to Graham Lockhart, standing on the other side of the city in a half-lit apartment with Rosa and Mia, it was the beginning of something far darker. He hadn't slept. None of them had. The news channels ran his name in red banners all night. Billionaire fugitive connected to international crime ring. Every word twisted the knife deeper. The FBI believed he'd destroyed the warehouse to erase evidence. The stock markets crashed on rumors of his death, and his company's board moved to dismantle everything he had built. Graham watched it all in silence. He didn't care about the empire anymore. What haunted him now wasn't the fall. It was the shadow that still stood behind it. Orion. The man had vanished after the explosion, leaving behind no trace. No body, no prints, no digital footprint. Darren had searched through every database, every contact, every whisper in the city's underworld. Nothing. It was as if the fire had erased him from existence. But Graham knew better. "He's still out there," he muttered, staring at the rain streaking down the window. "And he's not finished." Rosa looked up from where she was tending to Mia's scraped knee. "Mr. Lockhart," she said softly, "we can't live like this. We can't keep running from shadows." Graham turned to her, the weariness in his face replaced by something sharper. Resolve. "I'm not running," he said. "I'm hunting." Darren looked up from his laptop. "You sure about that?" "Because the FBI is still broadcasting your face on every screen between here and New York. You're the most wanted man in America right now." "We can't just walk into the open." Graham stepped closer. "No, we can't, but Orion can. He's not afraid of the light. He hides in plain sight, under names we know, companies we trust. If we want to expose him, we need to go where he feels safe." Darren frowned. "You have a plan?" Graham nodded slowly. "The one place I know he'll show up next, the investors' summit in Zurich. Marin was supposed to finalize his deal there. If Orion killed him, someone else will take his place to close it. Someone who thinks I'm gone." Rosa's eyes widened. "You're going to Zurich." He looked at Mia, who sat quietly drawing at the table. "We're going to end this where it started." 2 nights later, they were halfway across the Atlantic. The small private jet rattled through the turbulence, lights flickering as the storm brewed over the ocean. Darren sat at the controls, expression grim. Rosa and Mia sat beside each other, wrapped in blankets, exhaustion written across their faces. Graham sat by the window, his reflection framed by flashes of lightning. His mind replayed every moment, the phone call, the child's warning, the fire. And underneath it all, the same question pulsed like a wound. Why him? He wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a criminal either. What made Orion choose him? As if hearing his thoughts, Darren's voice came from the cockpit. "You ever wonder why he picked you?" Graham looked up. "Every second." "He doesn't just target the rich," Darren continued. "He targets the ones who think they're untouchable. Men who can't see the knife until it's already in their back. Graham smirked bitterly. Then I was the perfect mark. Darren glanced back. Maybe once. Not anymore. The jet landed under the cover of dawn. Zurich was gray and wet, its streets gleaming under streetlights. Graham and Darren moved through the quiet airport wearing caps and coats that made them nearly unrecognizable. Rosa and Mia were escorted by a trusted contact to a safe apartment in the old town, far from the summit. Graham kissed the child's forehead before leaving. "I'll come back," he said. Mia looked up at him with the same calm eyes she'd had the day they met. "I know," she whispered, "because you're not scared anymore." The summit was held inside an opulent hotel overlooking the lake, a cathedral of wealth and whispers. Every guest wore the same look, confidence polished into armor. Inside, deals were made with smiles that never reached the eyes. Graham and Darren entered through the service corridor, slipping past security with forged credentials. The air smelled of champagne and power. From the mezzanine, Graham spotted him. At first, it seemed impossible. The man was talking easily with two investors, laughing softly, the very image of charm. But the tilt of his head, the silver cufflinks glinting beneath his sleeve, it was him. Orion. Wearing a new name, a new face, but the same eyes. Cold, calculating. Darren's hand tightened on his shoulder. "You sure that's him?" "I'd know that voice anywhere," Graham said. The plan was simple. Darren had already hacked into the summit's security system. The moment Orion accessed the server to upload his fraudulent contracts, the data would trace back to his hidden network, exposing every shell company, every offshore account. All they needed was the trigger, but nothing about Orion was simple. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Graham found himself face to face with two of Orion's guards, men he recognized from the warehouse. They froze. For a second, the entire world went silent. Then chaos exploded. Gunshots ripped through the corridor. Graham dove behind a marble pillar as shards of glass shattered above him. Darren returned fire, his voice cutting through the noise. "He's running, north wing." Graham chased him through the hallways, the echo of his footsteps mixing with the screams of startled guests. The corridors twisted like a maze, mirrors and chandeliers reflecting flashes of violence. Orion moved with calculated calm, slipping through a back door that led onto the rooftop terrace. The wind howled across the open deck. Rain slicked the tiles, and below, the city sprawled like a sea of light. "You're a difficult man to kill," Orion said, stepping out of the shadows. "Most men crumble when their world does. But you rebuild it out of fire. Why me?" Graham shouted, his voice cracking in the storm. "You could have chosen anyone." Orion smiled faintly. "Because I knew you'd fight back. And the harder you fight, the stronger my legend grows. Fear isn't born from monsters. It's born from survivors who can't prove what they've seen." Lightning split the sky. The two men circled each other like wolves. Orion drew a gun. "This is where your story ends." But Graham was already moving. He slammed into him, knocking the gun from his hand. The weapon skidded across the wet floor, disappearing into the darkness. They grappled at the edge of the terrace, feet slipping dangerously close to the drop. "You think you can expose me?" Orion hissed. "Even if you win, I'll just become another name, another ghost." "Then I'll spend the rest of my life chasing ghosts," Graham said. With one last surge of strength, he shoved Orion backward. The man stumbled, slipped, and fell. The sound was swallowed by the storm. Graham stood there, chest heaving, the rain washing the blood from his hands. Darren burst onto the roof seconds later, drenched and wide-eyed. "Is he—" Graham nodded slowly. "He's gone." Below them, sirens blared as security forces stormed the hotel. But this time, they weren't after him. Darren had already triggered the data dump. Every hidden account, every manipulated deal, every name under Orion's control was pouring into global servers. The truth was finally free. As dawn broke over Zurich, the rain softened into a quiet drizzle. Down in the old town apartment, Mia sat by the window, watching the clouds lift. She turned to Rosa and whispered, "He found the light." When Graham returned hours later, soaked, exhausted but alive, Mia ran to him, wrapping her small arms around his neck. He held her close, eyes burning with tears he hadn't shed in years. It was over, or so he thought, because deep beneath the rubble of Zurich's rooftops, in an alley swallowed by shadow, a hand, bloody, trembling, clawed its way out of the rain-soaked gutter. Orion was still alive, and the real ending was yet to come. The morning that followed was too quiet, an uneasy calm that didn't belong to a world that had just survived a war of shadows. The headlines across Europe screamed of justice and revelation. The Orion Syndicate exposed. International fraud network collapses. Graham Lockhart cleared of all charges. But beneath the noise, in the places the headlines couldn't reach, there was a hum, low, steady, dangerous. Because while the world believed Orion had fallen from that rooftop in Zurich, Graham Lockhart knew better. Evil like his didn't die with a fall. It waited, it adapted, and it came back when everyone least expected it. 3 weeks later, back in Chicago, the city looked different to Graham. Or maybe it was him who had changed. The tower that once carried his name was no longer his. The board had stripped him of ownership. The empire he built now belonged to investors who saw only numbers where he had left his blood and years. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the small foundation office on the south side, barely 3 rooms, 2 desks, and a handful of volunteers. On the glass door, painted in modest black letters, were the words, Lockhart Shield Foundation. Its mission, to protect small business owners from financial predators, to expose corporate fraud, and to teach people the truth about trust. Inside, the air smelled of paper, coffee, and something new, hope. Rosa sat at a desk, organizing files for families who'd been scammed by fake investment firms. Her calm steadiness had turned into quiet leadership. And across the room, Mia sat on the floor drawing a picture of the city skyline, her red ribbon tied neatly in her hair. Graham entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. The sight of them was enough to soften the hard lines that still lingered on his face. "Morning," he said, setting the cup on Rosa's desk. She smiled. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said simply. "It's nice to bring coffee to someone instead of demanding it." Mia giggled softly. "Mr. Graham's learning," he grinned at her. "From the best teacher in Chicago." But as light as the moment was, there was still something behind Graham's eyes, a weight that refused to leave. When the laughter faded, he stood by the window, looking out at the city. "They think it's over," he said quietly. "The papers, the agents, the lawyers, they think Orion died that night." Rosa turned to him. "You don't believe that?" He shook his head. "Men like him don't die in silence. They die making a point. If he's gone, I'd feel it. But I don't. Not yet." Darren Cole entered then, his heavy boots echoing on the floor. He carried a small file, his face grim. "You're right not to believe it," he said, tossing the file on the desk. Interpol traced one of Orion's shell accounts. It was reactivated yesterday. Same pattern, different country. Graham's jaw tightened. "Where?" "Singapore," Darren said. "But that's not the worst part. The name attached to it isn't Orion anymore." He flipped open the file. "It's Lockhart Trust Holdings." The room fell silent. Rosa stood, her voice trembling. "He's using your name?" Graham nodded slowly, anger flickering like fire in his chest. "He's not hiding anymore. He's mocking me. It's his way of saying the game isn't over." Mia looked up from her drawing, frowning. "He's like the spider again. You cut the web, but he's building a new one." Graham knelt beside her. "That's why we're going to stop him. But this time, not with fear. With light." Days turned into weeks as they prepared for the next move. Graham worked with Darren to build a global task force of forensic accountants, cybersecurity experts, and whistleblowers. The Lockhart Shield Foundation grew faster than anyone expected. News outlets began to see him not as the fallen billionaire, but as a man reborn, a symbol of redemption in a world that had almost devoured him. But behind the scenes, the war never stopped. Every day brought new threats, Emails laced with viruses, hacked communications, anonymous warnings. And yet, for every shadow that appeared, Graham and his team pushed back harder. Then one night, as rain drummed softly against the windows, an unmarked envelope arrived. No postage, no name, just 3 words scrawled across the front in neat handwriting. Still watching you. Rosa found it first. Her hands shook as she handed it to Graham. Is it him? Graham tore it open. Inside was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. It showed him, standing at the window of the Foundation's office, taken from across the street. On the back, in the same precise handwriting, was a single sentence. You built a shield, but even shields break. Darren cursed under his breath. He's here. In Chicago. Graham studied the photo for a long time. Then he smiled, not with fear, but with something colder, sharper. Good, he said. Let him watch. Let him see what real strength looks like. A week later, Graham stood once again in front of the media, not as a defendant, not as a tycoon, but as a man who had learned what power really meant. Cameras flashed. The crowd buzzed. He held a folder in his hand containing every record, every name tied to Orion's syndicate. Years ago, he began, his voice steady, I believed power was control. I was wrong. Power is truth, and truth doesn't live in the tallest towers. It lives in the courage of people who refuse to be silent. His eyes found Rosa and Mia in the front row. A child once taught me that even the smallest voice can uncover the biggest lie. This foundation exists because of her, because of every person who was told they didn't matter. Today we start again, not as victims but as protectors. Applause erupted. But even as the sound filled the hall, Graham's eyes flicked to the back of the room, where a man in a dark coat stood watching, face half hidden, hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, Graham's breath caught. The man smiled, slowly, knowingly, and turned to leave. Darren saw it too, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. You saw him? He whispered. Graham nodded, his voice calm. Let him go. Why? Because he's not the threat anymore. The truth is. That night, after the cameras were gone and the streets had gone quiet, Graham walked through the city alone. The wind was cold, carrying the hum of traffic and the faint glow of the river. He stopped at the bridge overlooking the skyline, the same skyline he used to own, the same city that had watched him rise and fall. Mia's words echoed in his head. He's like the spider again. Maybe she was right. Maybe Orion would always exist, in another name, another city, another form. But Graham no longer feared the web, because this time, he wasn't alone in it. Behind him, Rose's voice carried softly through the wind. You can't fight the darkness forever. He smiled faintly. I'm not trying to. I'm just making sure it doesn't win. The city lights reflected in the river like 1,000 small fires, each one burning bright enough to challenge the dark, and somewhere in those reflections, far away but never gone, a shadow watched and smiled. The game wasn't over. But for the first time, Graham Lockhart wasn't playing it to win. He was playing it to change the world.